Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar about CMS and how you can get the most out of it. Before we start, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Fernanda, and I will be your moderator today. And a few housekeeping items about our webinar. It's going to be about 45 minutes of presentation with 15 minutes for Q&A reserved at the end. And you can always ask questions at the Q&A box on your screen, and we'll be monitoring it. All right, a little bit about Rangle. Rangle is a lean innovation and digital transformation consultancy that solves the most compelling digital challenges facing small and large companies today. We are partnered with organizations of all sizes to imagine, design, and develop customer-centric software experiences. We've recently expanded, opening new offices in Amsterdam, Atlanta, and Tokyo, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with clients from various industries and parts of the world. We're hoping that this webinar is going to help you with your initiatives in the new year. All right. Before we start, I want to introduce you to our speakers. First, Dietmar Haast. He's Wrangle's VP of Digital Innovation. Dietmar is an engineer and technology leader with over 25 years of experience, ranging from plant for robotics to cloud-native e-commerce and modern web. He also has experience working on a global deployment of Adobe Experience Manager for an automotive company. As a VP of Digital Innovation here at Rangle, he specializes in helping companies apply technology to accelerate their business outcomes. Our next speaker is Rick Pullen, our Director of Digital Innovation. Rick works closely with clients to understand their organizational goals and create a technology roadmap that delivers optimal business value. As a former WCM solutions architect, Rick has an extensive background in both web platform renewal and enterprise system integration. He is a leader in helping teams create step-by-step transformation within corporate environments. Today, we're going to be talking about architecture paradigms, benefits of a decoupled model, and getting started with Headless before we jump into a Q&A. And now I'm going to pass on to Dietmar for our presentation.
Thanks, Fernanda. Yeah, so I mean, as we get going, we're going to look at the architecture paradigms, but I'm going to take a pause right at the beginning and acknowledge content is a very, very hard problem to solve. It's one of those aspects of technology where people underestimate how complex it really is. But when you take a step back and you look at content, even defining what content is can be difficult. For example, content used to be on a website, but today it's a website, it's a web app, it's native on iOS and Android. You have user data that needs to be mixed in there. So you've got user profiles, you might have third-party data that's added in as well. You've got IoT, you've got cloud, you've got analytics, internationalization, localization, accessibility, commerce, PIM. The list goes on. And add to that, personalization and A/B testing, and you understand how it can quickly go from a really simple static content model to something that's very complex that spans the whole organization. The other aspect of content that I've personally found very fascinating is how far spread it goes within your organization. You'll have content writers, copywriters, marketing department, designers, product strategy, legal, the business, and then you have the core people that use the platforms like your content authors, your content approvers, and then there's the quality assurance around the whole platform as well, which is very difficult considering content can live everywhere, and then the technology teams that actually build those platforms. So I think the first step in when you look at content for your business is acknowledging it's a very complex problem. I think people sometimes simplify it because it's quick to spin up, for example, a WordPress site. You can do that in a few hours and now you've got a content system running. Now that's a solved problem and it's a very narrow domain. So I think that's why we're having this talk today, is really to understand the decision making that goes into deciding, do you go with an enterprise content management platform or do you go with something open source and more lightweight and build an ecosystem? So I'm excited to talk about that. I've got Rick here as well. And we're really going to start at the highest level and then work through a decision-making framework that really unpacks the things you need to consider when making these decisions.
Yeah, so I think on this. right? So as Dietmar said, there's a huge range of potential problems in this space. It's a really big topic. And so, you know, as we go through this conversation in terms of platform selection, it's not necessarily just picking a single tool necessarily, but it's also understanding how that tool helps you solve some or more of those challenges.
Yeah, and the other thing I really want to point out is content really is the connection to your user base. I like to think of technology as the delivery system for that content, and you really have to choose that wisely, because there's current concerns and future concerns that really play in large when we look at these different content models. One pattern that we're seeing more and more often is that software is the most flexible way of managing these concerns. If you look at how infrastructure has changed, infrastructure used to be managed by people in much more of a rigorous fashion. Now there is infrastructure as code, basically software provisioning of infrastructure. And those same patterns are starting to happen in the content management area. Typically, you know, if you looked maybe a few years back, people would shop by products. They would look at feature sets and say, these are the features we need to solve our problem. However, when you go down that path of looking at features to solve a problem, it's only telling part of the story. Those features are very, very hard to implement, and they need to be, they need to support agility and change, modern development practices. So we're going to unpack that decision making, you know, about how you go about making that analysis. Do we go with an enterprise system or something different? Okay, before we actually go through the decision-making framework, I did want to touch on a few aspects as well. When it comes to solving the right problem, which was the previous slide, apologies for jumping back, there are a few things that we can, you know, confidently say that you should probably do ahead of time, and that's taking a look at your content. So do a content analysis. You know, how much content do you have today? What are the different content types? Who are the audiences that you're speaking to? And what various subjects are you talking about? Things to watch out for are content bloat, bad content, stale content, and design is critical, and tone of voice. So all of those factors are kind of in your content ops space, which is not the goal of this conversation, but they're all important in really defining what you're trying to solve. So once you've kind of gone through that and you've got a good understanding of where you want to take your content needs for your business, this is a framework that we follow to really make those decisions with confidence, because there's a lot of detail that isn't apparent when you're making these decisions that you gain with experience, and we'd like to share that experience now to aid in your decision making going forward. So what you see on the screen here is, on the left-hand side is the enterprise path. You know, these are our sophisticated products that have been built as a solution of disparate systems that you can orchestrate together to make compelling content solutions. So if I talk about that side, if you look at a marketing cloud, it gives you the facilities. If you look at the end-to-end suite of services on the left-hand side, basically you're buying services that have been curated by the enterprise marketing cloud or CMS, and you're buying those features, and what you have to do is look at how many of those features do you need to solve the problem you're trying to address. On the right-hand side, you've got the other end of the spectrum. You've got you know, modern development practices, lightweight. So you're largely looking at open source versus, you know, proprietary enterprise. That alone is a fundamental factor that you need to consider deeply. When you go down enterprise path, you're likely going down that path for a long period of time, because there's a large investment to get that platform up and running. It is a generalized tool. Even those features are there, you build on top and integrate them specific to your needs. So I think the time commitment sometimes is not clear. So enterprise versus open source. Open source, I think we've seen, you know, it's the growth on that side of the spectrum will continue to accelerate with cloud and cloud native infrastructure as code with modern front-end technologies. The open source side has innovation that is extremely quick, and I think you need to consider those where on the left-hand side, the company or the provider of that platform needs to keep pace with the industry. Open source, you know, it's a worldwide community that moves very, very fast and sometimes don't have the constraints that the others do. So I think that's one of your fundamental decision factors. The other aspect, if you look at the DevOps section here, DevOps is really, it's key to all organizations. There's 4 key metrics in the state of DevOps. And those 4 key metrics can measure your organization, whether you're a high-performing or low-performing organization, and they all relate to delivering incremental value quickly to end users. The lightweight model supports, infrastructure as code, lightweight deployments, automated testing. So you get a lot of advantages in the way you work. It supports an agile delivery model. On the flip side, you're setting up a number of services and products to mimic that enterprise CMS. So there is much more thought and work that needs to go into that space to give you that same feature set. The trade-off is built out and kind of defined by the vendor versus open and flexible, where you're bringing in the best of breed services together and build. The third aspect that we really want to highlight, and I think this is something that there's a lot to unpack, so Rick and I will probably have a dialogue on that, is cost. If you look at it from a very simplistic standpoint, it seems logical buying all the features that have been pre-built by a vendor. It was going to be the cheaper model. That really depends on which services you're planning on using, how much it costs to integrate the services, and the cost of owning that platform over a long period of time. And there's a lot of costs that you might not be aware of when you're first looking at these different products. For example, enterprise CMSs have long shelf lives. They have major versions, so if you've rolled out an enterprise cloud or CMS to your organization, you go through these big upgrade cycles where you're going from one major version to the next. You can't do those incremental changes. That has a cost to the organization because now you've got to go through, large-scale testing, large-scale content migrations, and then big bang deploys. Those are really big costs that you might not be considering up front. Now, to the right-hand side, you've got costs because, number one, open source, lightweight technologies, you can find a large resource pool of talent in those areas. So that's a distinct advantage as far as hiring and curating those people. You also don't need proprietary knowledge of a specific platform. So you've got a whole ecosystem of users and open source that's moving that along. And then you could argue which one is lower cost to keep updated, but I think the factor there is that you can upgrade small portions versus the large major version upgrade on the other side. So I think it comes down to speed and flexibility. There's definitely some advantages on the right-hand side. So to recap, fully built out features that you build on top of, or lightweight open source that you're bringing together to build that ecosystem for your platform.
Yeah, I would just add that as we go through these individual points a little bit deeper, the goal that we're trying to highlight here is that it may be attractive or sort of easy to take a look at individual features and try to solve different problems by feature set. We're highlighting here that there is a larger context around some of the other factors to consider when you're considering the overall longevity of the solution, the maintainability, and your total cost of ownership. So as Dietmar mentioned, one of the key differences as we look at the foundation of these platforms is whether you're going to invest in a proprietary technology or something that is open source. And for us, we look at open source as something that is much more innovative in the speed at which it adapts to the market and provides different sets of features. It is also a pretty big difference in the way that the Enterprise Suite works. Enterprise Suite tries to make all the features available in a way that is very flexible but almost generic and one size fits all. Open source, the difficulty in navigating that ecosystem is that the solutions tend to be specific to certain use cases, and understanding what's actually out there and how to pick the thing that you actually want to use can be a little bit tricky. On the flip side of that, you would get something that potentially gives you a much more tailored solution, best for your use case, and then you're limiting that investment where if you experiment with it, you decide it's not for you, the shift to a different platform is made much easier. And so for this point and the next one, we don't see these as necessarily critical factors. They're things that you want to take into consideration as you deploy the solution. So with traditional hosting, there's effectively two models. One is an on-premise where you are managing, the traditional infrastructure, the operating system, and the licensing for all these things. Which gives you a tremendous amount of control, but then there's some maintenance cost, both in personnel and time and these kinds of things, a lot of planning to make sure that, things are up to date with security holes and that type of thing. The flip side of that is then you can go fully managed solution, which means then you're fully handing over the reins. You maybe don't have the same level of flexibility, and there is effectively no in between. With a cloud native architecture, again, it's a little bit more complex, maybe a little bit more daunting to get into, but it gives you so much more flexibility, not just in terms of how you may want to pivot the solution or adjust to the needs more in the moment or more quickly, but you can also take advantage of some of the innovation that is out there in the market.
Yeah, I think I would add to that as well. I think scalability and resilience are key factors. Sometimes published servers can, they're harder to scale horizontally. The cloud providers are moving their platforms very, very fast. There's a lot of competition, and they continue to add value-added native services that are an advantage as well. But you're right, this is probably not the key decision factor.
And so the next point on here, again, is a bit of a difference in the paradigm for approaching how you do content management. It's funny, we're kind of going back to how content management was maybe 10 years ago. There was a shift where originally content management was about these very templated, very structured type of content, which was very rigid in its implementation. And so there was a push, particularly on the marketing side, to have a platform where content authors could manage the presentation. And that's all nice and good when you have one or very few channels, but as we're seeing now in the market, there's all sorts of different channels where you're trying to have a consistent messaging and a consistent voice of that shared content across all the different channels. And so then managing that in the context of a single presentation becomes a little bit challenging to how you're able to reuse that content. And very often we see clients having that focus on a single presentation, and then all the other presentations are sort of second-class citizens in that sense. And so with the open source model and newer technologies, we're really focusing on the headless content management, which has become a bit of a buzzword, but it means providing content as a service that is part of a larger ecosystem of services working together to achieve those goals. And the goals can be different around different channels or how you market that content or how you tailor your user experience. But again, the content should be the same, and ideally you structure it in a way that is maximally reusable.
Yeah, headless content management brings in some unique aspects, particularly as Rick mentioned, when you go from an experience where it was a one-to-one relationship where your authoring experience matched the page you're editing, switching to this kind of loosely coupled content model where content is somewhat agnostic of where it's actually consumed. It makes the authoring experience very different. And then the training for your organization is also different because, that content that you're changing, you can't just necessarily point to a specific page. It could be consumed in an app. It could be consumed in multiple areas of a web app. So there are different concerns and different paradigms, but effectively, it was a necessary step because content no longer lives in one touch point. It goes to many touch points, potentially to other third-party downstream systems. What that speaks to is just more complexity that needs to be managed. Now, enterprise content management systems have kind of retroactively added headless features. The part that, at least in my mind, is a tricky aspect there is a lot of the features that were originally built into those systems were for managing the presentations. For example, if you were doing personalization, you could build different renditions of a piece of content. Then those renditions would be rendered out differently depending on the targeting tool you're using. If you remove the presentation layer or the head, now you've got to build those in your front-end system and do more work anyways. So I think some of the values start to change as a result of headless being a large push in the industry. So that is an interesting space.
there is a potential pitfall there as well when we're talking about a hybrid model where you still want to retain those presentation capabilities for one channel, but still make your content structured in a way that is reusable. Often what we find is the content structure becomes still very focused or influenced by that one presentation, and so may not necessarily be as reusable as you would imagine it to be. And so then, as you try to get into headless approaches for other channels, there's a little bit more stumbling that comes across in trying to make best use of a content that may not be appropriately structured for that type of reuse. So the final one in the foundation here is really the crux of at least the enterprise side of the equation. With the enterprise suite of features and the marketing clouds, the real selling point here is that if you are the type of organization that does actually have all of these needs for a full suite of features, and you're trying to have the least sort of complicated infrastructure for your authors to use, or in a different way, maybe you don't have as much development staff, and so you're trying to build a solution that is mostly managed by a marketing team versus a development team. The enterprise suite will say we can do all of these things. That's not to say that there's no effort associated with enabling those, configuring them to make sense in your use cases. But as you're looking at this, if you're saying we need these 50 different features, it makes more sense to have a unified approach versus trying to get 50 different open source solutions to all play together. Realistically, some companies will jump the gun and say, oh yes, this is the future where we want to be 5 years from now. The reality is that implementing these 50 features, if you're brand new to most of them, requires a tremendous amount of effort and learnings to actually get them right and actually get something out there on your website. So it's best to start small and iterate and improve on that as you discover what is next for your ecosystem.
Yeah, when you look at build to fit, I think one of the keys is the ability to pivot quickly and to change small portions of it. Those are distinct factors versus on the other side, there's a set of services and they evolve at the pace of the organization maintaining that. Agility, flexibility, all those things are becoming more and more important. User expectations, I think we've all heard the talk tracks, but personalization, content that's relevant to a user, all these things are being elevated and becoming expected. Being able to bring in the best tool, the best products to support that is definitely an advantage versus the full product. There are ways to integrate into the enterprise suites as well. But again, if you're already on those platforms and you're already using those services, you have some flexibility there.
So just to further on that point, so here's roughly what we're looking at in terms of an enterprise capability model for content management features. So for organizations that are already looking at 70–80% of these things, the open source model may not be the best approach just because of how complex everything would get, right? If you're looking at maybe 5 to 10 of these kinds of features, that's more the argument where we could say there may be a better way to structure this with open source tools, especially as you look into how these different components actually need to interact with each other. If you're looking for a unified solution where you're building all of these features and you want to make them available to every single channel just on the off chance you might want to use them, then again, there's an argument for a consolidated type of platform.
Yeah, I think I would add to that. Yes, I agree, but there's a but.
Yep.
And the but is when you look at all these services, you need skilled resources with experience on all of these to ensure you successfully integrate them. I think sometimes people look at these systems as they're completely built, and then they put brand new resources without any training or background, and then it's a best effort connection of all these services. And what ends up happening is an over-complex implementation, which is not a fault of the product, but if it's not implemented properly, you wind up with a system that is extremely hard to maintain, that is extremely hard to test. So I think that's there's a lot of notional aspects that you need to layer on top of the understanding. The other aspect is it's hard to find people that are experienced in all of these products. There's a certain cost that gets built into this model, but I would agree if it's a very large organization and they need all of these features and they're committed to bringing the right people to the table, it is a very powerful solution when it's all working and orchestrated together. But it's never underestimate the time, the resources, and the cost of that service is quite expensive. Having said all that, by investing that time, resources, and cost, you're going to be using this platform for some time. So you have to be comfortable that this is the stack you're going with, and that's the trade-off you've potentially made. The other aspect I've found with large organizations, when you look at distributed delivery of content over the globe, each region wants their content done in a certain way. They want their own marketing, their own branding, their own tone of voice, all of these things. And some of these larger platforms dictate that overall feel wherever it's used. So for example, let's say you've got a huge market like the USA and then a smaller market like, let's say, I don't know, I'll pick up like Costa Rica. Their needs are somewhat different, yet when you're using a holistic global platform, they're sort of treated the same, whether it's Costa Rica or the USA. You can't just pivot those needs as simply unless you make different tiers. So there's a lot of nuances when you look at scaling this globally that you need to take into account. The other aspect is I think once you have a larger platform, you tend to use that for all concerns. And I think one of the key areas is sometimes you just need a static site. There's tools like Gatsby that are static site generators that are modern. They hook in with content management systems like Contentful or Netlify, and they are absolutely fantastic for delivering large amounts of content and rendering it statically, which is easy to scale. You put the static content on a CDN, that content scales globally, super easy to maintain, super easy to pivot, and low cost of ownership. So I think one of the key takeaways is really looking at your various content needs. And even if you do already have an enterprise CMS, it doesn't have to solve all the problems. A static rendering system has very powerful ways of handling those. They hook up with React, Angular, and Vue, and you can build really powerful applications that way. So I think everything comes in context, and that's layered on top of this diagram is the nuances of getting this done.
Yeah, and I think it's more than just getting it done. I mean, one thing you said there is it's not just about implementation, right? There's nuances in terms of different regions have different needs. And so there's a whole business aspect to this where it's how are you actually solving these issues? If you're getting into content targeting and personalization for the first time, just understanding how your users are behaving, how they interact with the website, what are the different segments. There's a ton of learnings there. And so, it's one of those scenarios where just buying a large platform that has the capability doesn't necessarily mean that it accelerates how quickly you can get those capabilities out to your presentation, right? It's more than just the implementation effort. It's also all of those learnings that need to get into it. So we'll just start to move through a few of these a little bit quicker. So with the development operations side of things, one of the key differences is the support argument. So with an enterprise product, you're looking at obviously having some vendor support. That means that you then have to install these things on a supported configuration, operating system, virtual machines, what have you. And then you have some licensing constraints, right? So one of the big differences here in terms of the flexibility and the speed of development is that with licensing constraints, in certain cases, you can get into a bit of a bottleneck trying to reuse the same environment for multiple instances, especially as part of your development flow. Conversely, it can get quite expensive to license as many environments as you would need. With an infrastructure as code approach, there's a little bit more heavy lifting up front to figure out what it is that you need and how you're going to approach it. But then it's much more flexible and adaptable as you need to change that over time. And ideally, depending on where you are on that spectrum of having a modern sort of infrastructure as code is, those tweaks can be then really quickly, and it doesn't have a huge cost to pivoting.
Yeah. Having multiple environments for solving different concerns is very important. Provisioning large-scale enterprise marketing clouds is not as simple in that respect. it comes down to also for load testing. When you want to do a load test on an enterprise environment, it's much more difficult than on something you could potentially spin up for a load test. So there's a lot of detail within the actual infrastructure side, and it comes down to flexibility. Yeah, and the next box, fast release cycles. This is one of the most important aspects, is to be able to make small, nimble changes. The smaller the batch size, the more automated testing, the more confidence you can go to production, means you can move and pivot very quickly. That is really a key to be able to perform, to deploy and make changes quickly, and also back out if they don't work. We feel this is one of the key areas to consider. It's not, our opinion. It's already kind of agreed to in different circles, such as, like I mentioned, the State of DevOps report. These key metrics have separated different organizations. So this is something you should consider very closely. And in my experience, the environments themselves, there is a lot of work to do on the enterprise side. For example, it's interesting, when Rick and I thought about this topic, it's so vast and there's so many different things to consider. It's tough to talk about all of them. I'll bring one up in this case. Some clients have very complex needs when it comes to pushing content live. In other words, they have to create this large body of content that has to be reviewed by multiple stakeholders and then transitioned live at a click of a button to match an event. With those concerns, you need what I consider called dark sites. You need to be able to have an environment where you can push all this content to, have everybody review it, and then with the click of a button say that is one big transaction goes live. So the more flexibility you have for adding environments, the better off you will be in the long run.
And then the last item we have on this slide, again, not one of the key decision factors, but something that's part of that equation. With a traditional platform, because you're looking at provisioning either a virtual machine or having that managed cloud, typically you'll find that you're provisioning for maximum load. So essentially, you have all of these servers that are active on your presentation layer to react and able to handle the maximum type of capacity that you have. And so that gives you some consistent pricing and some predictable pricing. But on some events for specific sales, especially in your retail market, then you may find that your website struggles to keep up. On the flip side is with an infrastructure as code, or at least a cloud-based approach, you can take advantage of some elastic capacity, which means that your costs may vary a little bit more, but then you're not impacting the user experience as much or at all. And so then ultimately your customers are potentially happier with the result. Dietmar alluded to this one a little bit earlier. So one of the key differences here is that with the open source market, finding the correct talent to help you in your journey is or can be a lot easier. It tends to focus a little bit more on programming languages, and so then there's a little bit more flexibility to move around different frameworks. Whereas with a very specific enterprise platform, you effectively need some specialists in that platform, right? It's one of those things where, given the breadth of things that you need to know about that one specific platform, it becomes very difficult to find somebody who is more of a generalist in that space. And so then they can command higher rates or be more difficult to find. The one after that we kind of mentioned briefly in terms of a trade-off for the approach to infrastructure, but here in the context of cost, again, it's a bit of a which one works better for your model. So the traditional hosting tends to come with more requirements around maintainability, and you need a team to basically keep the lights on. With cloud computing, it's something that's perhaps a little bit easier to monitor, but then there's maybe a little bit more of a learning curve, given that these technologies are a little bit new, and understanding how they work and how to react to outages is maybe a bit more of a learning curve. And then finally, of course, the licensing versus the lower cost upkeep. So one of the things that large enterprises tend to shy away from open source is the perspective that open source is less well managed, or that they don't have patches and cycles that are consistent, which is not at all the case. Most open source projects, at least the more robust frameworks that are out there, do have a very active community. Usually there's a company or some type of organization behind it that ensures there is a certain cadence and they are patching those security flaws. And so in the end, the low cost upkeep, we realize that in both models, there's always a need for a development team and there's a lot of effort regardless, but at least you're not paying for that licensing. And you avoid some of those big upgrade cycles. On the flip side is then you don't necessarily have a dedicated vendor that's available to help you with that sort of thing. So as we move forward with this, I think it's probably obvious that we see a lot of benefits with the headless approach. Again, as much as there are tons of value with an enterprise CMS, you have to approach that with a little bit more caution than perhaps some do. And so with a headless approach, there's a lot of benefits. There's some effort. There's some learning curve, but we'll go into a little bit of those. As we move into the next slide here, again, just repeating this capability model, when you buy into a large platform like this, there's going to be an implied onus to start making use of these features. And so what might get a little bit lost is that because you are paying for these things and you're licensed for all these things, you're going to be looking at this as sort of a checklist to say, okay, well, what should we be building out next? Let's go for this next feature. And so what you may find is that you lose sight of what your customers are actually looking for or what the market demands. And so as we look at some of the other points of view on this topic out there in the marketplace, there's a lot of times people will bring up the fact that the customer experience is key. Make sure that your customers are happy and really use that as the focus for how you build out your next features and where you prioritize your investments. One of the things that is not mentioned as much is that a large proportion of companies believe they're delivering superior customer experiences and listening to their market. The reality is that only about 8% achieve this goal according to this study. Now that statistic is a little bit dated, so I would hope that it's actually higher now, but it does call into question how well are you listening to your customers, how much are you actually interacting with them on a real level, and it's beyond just sort of the clickstream analytics. It's more, are they using your website just because it's the only thing available or because they actually genuinely find it useful? It's that sort of question that you want to be asking. And so that kind of ties into, where Rangle sees our position in the market is really this rapid iteration and improvement. So rather than trying to build out a full capability model of everything that you could possibly use, we're looking to build something small and then help improve upon that with those learnings and really getting that active feedback early. So again, the capture feedback here from your actual real customers, whether that be through some type of online feedback tool, or if you're actually going further and doing some user journeys and interacting and having some workshops with your users. Either way, at least you have that feedback and you're starting to integrate and adapt your roadmap to those kinds of things. And then adapt quickly and iterate. And that's exactly what the headless approach enables you to do, is pivot. If you make some investments, you find they're not working, it's not a huge cost to then try something else. And so here, just to illustrate a little bit of the differences. So traditionally with an enterprise CMS, you have that integrated presentation. And what that means is that from a system integration perspective, you'll have to connect to some of these backend systems. And the CMS can become a bit of a bottleneck, if not in terms of effort, at least in terms of the data stream. And so the enterprise CMS becomes that aggregate of all the different pieces of information. And so what happens there is that your team that is building out that CMS, which again requires some specialists, you may find that it's slowing down your progress because those specialists can only do so many things at once, and they're trying to connect with all the things in your ecosystem. Conversely, with the headless model, it can look a little bit more complex in terms of an architecture because there's a lot more connection points. The key difference is that your integrations between these different things are much more lightweight, they're much more tailored to the purpose, they're more easily maintainable and easier to shift. And so as much as this might become a little bit more painful to monitor, or at least in the short term as people are getting used to this model, in the end it's much more maintainable and flexible. It allows teams to work in parallel across these different things. And as you're looking to maintain these things or replace them, then your cost is much less.
Yeah, I think when you look at this diagram, you could really see how making a major upgrade on the enterprise CMS has a large scale impact versus, let's say, we want to look at just the customer portal. We could potentially build out 2 instances of that and then A/B test those in parallel. So it's those smaller granular aspects of work that we can kind of tailor as we go.
So then just really quickly to recap sort of all the things we've talked about, the decoupled architecture, while it does have some effort and a learning curve again, we do believe that it allows you to iterate faster, to develop in parallel, build to suit and replace as needed. So that effectively is all benefits of having a decoupled architecture and having different parts of this being, sort of standalone, and they talk to each other, obviously. But then if you replace one of them, it doesn't impact all of those other pieces. Secondly, reducing operational costs and avoiding vendor lock-in. So this is something that, rather than having one investment in a single solution, you can then have that flexibility to change pieces as you need. And again, the operational cost comes through from being able to not be tied into a very specific sort of infrastructure or operating systems and all the licensing that comes along with that. You have a lot more options and you can change them as your needs change. And then finally, again, attracting top talent and lessen the developer training curve is accomplished effectively through open source technologies. Because the code is out there, people can sort of start to use these things to prototype, to learn, and it's a little bit easier to find the resourcing for that.
Yeah, and looking at the other options, static rendering is probably an area that deserves a little more attention. I think with products like Gatsby really pushing the limits there, it's a space that shows you there's a unique way of handling different scenarios. Gatsby's also got MDX coming out, which is a real nice tie into single page applications like React. It allows you to write Markdown that renders components on your front end. There's a lot of movement in this area, and the way Jamstack works is it's a static rendering system. So your content management system like Contentful or other headless CMSs connect in just like any other data source, and then that all goes through a Git workflow and gets pushed out to production in a build. It's a really unique way of handling this problem that shows a lot of promise. And looking at the roadmap, there's a lot of future potential that ties in nicely with the models we've talked about here. And then no CMS. There are cases where a dev-centric approach might make sense. We didn't dig deep into it, but content authoring means you're training users. You've got to roll that out to your organization. You're working with a set of users that are not necessarily familiar, and you're also building in some rigidity around the process. There are times when you could go with a pure static site, pure dev-centric, and handle that content need that way. It ultimately gives you the ultimate flexibility because you can change as you need. You've seen this case where some people need a quick microsite, and there's other paradigms where a no CMS solution is in the future probably more and more likely, because as the ecosystem becomes more complex, all the different concerns, a no CMS option is low cost. You build it, you test it, and then you can see if you can iterate on it. So I think that's another area to consider as well in your content needs.
And so to be fair, Headless does have some new challenges, especially if you're just getting into it. So as previously mentioned, we're shifting some of the code complexity for an architecture complexity. There is a potential for creating disparate interfaces. On the flip side of that, your interfaces may be best tailored for those specific use cases. But what that means is that if you have sort of a content author that is managing multiple different parts of your solution, then they may have to go to different tools for different reasons. Scaling for enterprise content volume can impose some additional constraints depending on how you do it, especially if we're talking about starting to do some of those more advanced features in terms of content targeting and segmentation. It's not that it can't be done, it's that the mechanism for integrating these different kinds of things needs a little bit more forethought and planning. I think the most important out of all of these points, though, is that a success in a decoupled architecture really just requires having cross-functional teams. And so if your organization is the type where you have these silos of marketing versus development versus IT, and you have sort of these gates to jump through as the functionality passes through these different teams, you're probably not going to be successful with a headless approach. Headless does kind of require more agility, more nimbleness, more communication. And so if you have a cross-functional team where you have a product owner from marketing, you have a development team, IT is involved so that they understand what's coming, how is it going to be deployed, how do they maintain it, what happens when the monitoring throws up a red flag. It requires that communication and the reduction of those barriers to make sure that everybody's on the same page and everybody's working towards solving a common challenge. And then finally, some of these other points on here is because we're shifting the complexity to an architectural paradigm, you do need a little bit more strategy and communication across some of these different teams to make sure that there's a domain model in place that avoids sort of that duplication of code and content. So where are we going with this? Effectively, what people might be waiting for is how do you get started? So obviously, there's a whole bunch of benefits here. And so the first thing we would just guard against, and this is something Dietmar mentioned way at the beginning, is that there's a whole lot of organizational process that needs to be figured out first. So here we're not really solving something, or you don't want to jump to a technology to necessarily solve the problem. There's all sorts of other pieces in here that still need to be figured out, whether you're going headless, whether you're going enterprise CMS. No matter what, these are a lot of the questions that sometimes organizations get bogged down in. And you do need a lot of thinking because here the technology is not necessarily going to help you solve these issues. So that's number one. And then finally, as we mentioned, the iterative approach to building something out. So start small, identify a technology that you think might actually work for a very specific use case. So if you're just trying to see, hey, let's play around with this CMS, you're not necessarily going to be successful. If you pick one use case where you say, hey, we have a new project, it's sort of low risk. Let's try to implement this in a new technology and see how it works for you. And I think in doing that, you're going to work through a lot of these more process-based challenges rather than technology. And then, the fact that you can put something out there that is small, that is nimble, it's experimental, and then build on top of it is really how we see that working through to being successful. In this diagram, I also have sort of a dotted line to enterprise CMS. So as we alluded to, there is a potential, especially with most of the modern CMS platforms out there, you can start to do a headless content distribution, even though you may have a presentation for something else. The approach there would be to pick a single purpose presentation layer that does not sort of overlap with any of your existing ones. So if you have a customer self-service portal, for instance, that can consume some of your existing content, but also consumes data from other sources, that might be one candidate for that type of approach.
All right, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm sure our listeners have a lot to think about. So now we're gonna jump into our Q&A. And just a reminder for everyone who's following us live, you have a question box on your screen that you can submit questions. But we have a couple already that were sent, so we can get started. So our first question is, how do you preview content in context in a headless model?
Great question. That is the fundamental change when you go to headless that probably catches most people. You know, it sounds great that your content is void of presentation, but then how do you know? You know, people typically look at the presentation and say, I want to change that element on the page. Now, there's various ways that's slowly being solved. For example, there's browser plugins and plugins in general, so that if you're on that page, you can click that button and it'll bring you to that content within the headless CMS. So kind of guiding you from the presentation back into the authoring experience. That might not be as fluid as the other approach where you've got a tree structure and you're navigating the core navigation on your site to the actual page. However, it is at least a way to kind of quickly go from where the content exists today back into editing that specific content. Rick, do you have any other?
Yeah, I would say it's also, there are some solutions out there, depending on which products or frameworks you choose, where you still can get that very integrated experience where you make a change in your CMS, hit a preview button, and then be able to see it on some other URL. It may not be as tightly integrated as perhaps some of these other enterprise CMSs, because again, the whole point of an enterprise CMS is to tie everything together into one UI. In this case, it's maybe one of the, drawbacks of this approach that is maybe a little bit less effective.
Yeah, at this point, at least from my perspective, it's still not as simple as it used to be. For example, if that content is on a mobile app, an app that you've installed, you can't go directly from that to the content because these contents are agnostic. They're just defined in the CMS. Imagine as like a little piece of JSON content. That comes down to training. The authoring experience is more complex. The users need to understand that this is the type of content and here are all the areas that might be used in. So there's just more overhead, but you get that same flexibility. It doesn't mean just sticking to a one-to-one relationship and you're only going to have web is the right answer. I think there'll be innovative ways to solve that. So at this point, I see a lot of promise. Gatsby has a live preview environment. I think as long as you're getting the main concern in a live preview environment and then understand there's other areas where that content may be that maybe you're using documentation or process flows or expertise to handle those scenarios. But it's a tough one. That's the trade-off, that you're dealing with.
Thank you. Our next question is about some of the features that you might have in the larger, the enterprise CMS. So about segmentation and content targeting. So does the headless approach support segmentation and content targeting?
Yeah, there's two approaches to that I can think of. The first is a client-side sort of JavaScript-based approach. So more of like an A/B testing type of approach, where as you understand the client that's coming through and requesting that page, you can dynamically replace content with a different data source, presuming that your CMS is sort of categorized these different alternative content in a way that can be fetched based on some type of attribute. The other option is to let the CMS again handle that. The CMS can be aware in some ways of which presentation mechanism is requesting the content. The presentation can relay a lot of those attributes that we know about the visitor, and then the actual CMS API can deliver different content based on sort of those attributes. So those are two ways that you can do it. And then again, it goes back to the tool set that you're selecting. So most of the open source platforms, at least the more lightweight ones, will not necessarily have a segmentation or content targeting module built in, but there's some of these different solutions that you can plug into that. And again, it's more about the reuse. So with the CMS approach, we're looking to have raw content that is able to be distributed and consumed in different ways. The segmentation can sort of be on top of that in some models so that it's very applicable to whatever the context is.
Yeah, I mean, the segmentation, you can tie into that with whatever tool you're making those segments with, whether you're using, Google Analytics or Adobe, used to be called Omniture, I think it's Adobe Analytics now. You can tie into those and then use also machine learning on top of that to make decisions in real time. All of these things have to be considered and built. Personalization can be very simple to extremely complex. It can be done in the headless fashion, I think in the traditional one-to-one relationship, it was much simpler. You could basically have the experience decoupled. So a content author, as I mentioned earlier, they build various content renditions like A, B, and C. Then a person in the analytics suite could then target for content A, I want this user segment. For content B, I want this user segment. So that could all be done without any development work whatsoever, and that was very nice. As you start to remove the head of the CMS, though, that starts to come into the exact same problem that Rick was talking about, and you need to handle those concerns anyways. So I think with the increased complexity, that's where the value proposition starts to get more difficult between the two. So I think, you know, that's the point of this conversation. And none of the answers are very easy. As I started off, content is complex. It probably hits the largest user base within your organization, and it is one of the most important aspects. It's what your customers see at every touch point. So there has to be an attention to the detail and a real emphasis on doing it right. So hopefully this helped.
Thank you. Thanks for the answer. Looks like we don't have any other questions that have come in, but our time is almost up, so we can start wrapping up. But before I do that, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and thanks for Rick and Dietmar for sharing your knowledge with us today. And is there anything else you want to say before we end?
I think the next few years will be very interesting to see how the two different options, how they progress. The technology space is moving so rapidly that I think it's going to be hard for a single enterprise to handle all concerns. So time will tell, and we'll see the challenges on both sides of the options. So I'm excited to see how that works out.
All right. Yeah, it's a very complex topic. We'll see what happens in the next few years. Thanks so much, everyone, and we'll end. Have a great rest of your day.